So when I say the time is now, the time is right to do this now, we have the right processes, we have the right technology, we just need to implement it and, understand that, it's going to take time before we get it 100% correct, but it can be done. And we're actually seeing these results already. It's exciting.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On today's episode of Power Supply, we will speak with Denise Odenkirk, VP of Supplier Sales at GHX, and we're going to be talking about one of those sticky processes that is still challenging healthcare supply chains and their respective suppliers alike. There's a lot of opportunity to improve the process and efficiency. What process are we talking about? Well, the bill-only PO process. You probably saw it in the title for this episode, and it drew you in. Hey, is today's conversation? It's going to be one that, honestly, it's probably a 3-hour conversation. Let's get it down to 30 minutes if we can.
We definitely did that in this case, and we're going to be talking about case to cash. So come on, stick around and listen.
We'll be right back with Denise Odenkirk.
Bam! I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
We are speaking now with Denise Odenkirk, VP of Supplier Sales at GHX. And honestly, Denise, I know this is one of your favorite topics, but it also happens to be one of mine. Bill-only POs, the dynamics behind it. And I've had a lot of conversations with healthcare on the front lines about the challenges with this. But what I love about the discussion today is we're going to get a better appreciation and look at what's happening on the supplier side of this equation and how we create some synergies there. So excited to have you on the Power Supply podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So Denise, why don't we start? Just tell us about yourself, your role at GHX, and how did you find yourself loving the bill-only PO topic?
Well, interesting background that I bring. I describe myself as a Swiss Army knife. So I've spent 30 years, not to date myself too much, but in the trenches of healthcare supply chain. And I've really dealt with all of the different processes between sales, IT, operations, and finance. So while I cannot claim to be an expert in any of the processes, I can tell you I bring a pretty good purview of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's where I'm planning on taking us today. And what's really important to me is how a lot of these processes around bill only impact both the suppliers and a provider's balance sheets. And I think it's time to improve.
Well, let's just define this because, we have people that listen to this show that are at all kinds of different levels of experience, and they might be non-clinical. So then they're all of a sudden tuning in and they're like, I'm not really familiar with the bill only PO process and some of the headaches that arise from it. So why don't we set the table and just what is it? What exactly is the bill only PO and why does it differ so much from maybe standard procurement and purchasing processes?
So first thing, just to manage the audience's expectations, I'm not going to talk about surgical procedures today. I'm not going to talk about field inventory. We really are going to do a deeper dive on the process I refer to as case to cash. Which is the bill only process. And I really do want to take us through the whole entire process to better understand where we actually have breakdowns. It's a process that really does require change. And coincidentally, about a week ago, I met with a provider and we were talking about a number of things. And he shared with me that the only people who actually like change are babies.
Oh, really?
That's one way to put it.
Because I don't know anything's changing.
Yeah, so Justin, Gary, and Hayes, I have to tell you, we've got a lot of dirty diapers out there that are on the bill-only process. So that's what we're going to get into today. And, it doesn't need to be this way. So the other thing I throw out there, we're actually seeing some providers and suppliers improve the process. So the ideas I'm going to be sharing today are not rainbows and butterflies and utopia. This is real stuff that we can be implementing now to improve the processes. So, but getting back to your question, so why is the bill only process different from regular orders? So I'm going to kind of get into that a little bit. All the listeners that are on the call, the thing that's different is really the ownership of inventory and the overall flow of data. And we're going to kind of pop the hood and get into some details here. So everybody hang on. I think you are going to find it very insightful just to understand why the processes are different. But just to, again, set the table, with regular orders of supplies, there's a full procure to pay process. It's supported by ERP systems, and it's very standard. You've got a purchase order, an acknowledgement, advance ship notice and invoice, and then a subsequent payment. And all of those processes flow very nicely. The bill only process is different, and it's unique because the PO is created after the product's used in a case. And it's needed by the manufacturer to trigger an invoice and then subsequently a payment. So that's the thing that's different. It's kind of a timing thing. But in addition to that, the bill only is used when a sales rep brings inventory into a surgical case. So take like a knee, a hip, a pacemaker. That inventory is not owned by the provider. It's on the manufacturer's books. Okay. So when it's used, it's billed. And the rep actually controls the replenishment and where it's sent. So they actually, if they use a hip in a procedure, they'll need to have a replenishment hip the same size sent either to their home, to the hospital, to FedEx, wherever that rep actually manages their field inventory. So that's what's really different. A lot of the systems today don't have standardized processes for dealing with these bill-only orders, as the regular orders are so easy to manage. So that's just at the table.
Would you say the normal process is very linear? And so it's like almost one dimensional, but this process of case to cash, I like that. It's a great tagline. There's things that are running in parallel. And so you actually have to coordinate whether or not, instead of it's like this happens, okay, check that box. Now we're on to the next thing. Because you're running parallel, you're not really sure if all the boxes got checked. And then somebody is getting this, most likely accounts payable at the very end, and realizing where the gaps are.
I think you raise a really good point, Justin. There's a lot of things happening in parallel and a lot of systems, and there's different capabilities of those systems. So there's a lack of standardization, there's timing issues, and a tremendous amount of rework. It's frankly shocking to look at the calendar. I'm looking right now, it's 2024, and we've got some really, really manual processes. that we're having to deal with. So as I said, it's a process ripe for change, and it stinks at the moment.
Denise, I'll jump right in here because this really takes me back. I won't even say how long. But I used to be an orthopedic rep myself. I sold hips and knees, and I still vividly remember being in the room, opening the implants, taking the stickers and putting them on a piece like an invoice type thing that the hospital had, and then taking it in there, and then she would issue a PO. But that was 20 plus years ago, and it really hadn't moved too much. And it's shocking to me that I know that we've had some, we might get into there, but it really hadn't moved a long way from those days, didn't seem like.
It really hasn't, Hayes, and some of it is related to system issues. The good news, as the hospitals are starting to move to cloud-based ERP systems, they now have the capabilities to support these processes. There's also other tools that are coming to market that are taking away a lot of the rework. So the time is now to actually improve the processes, which is one of the reasons I was real excited about joining this podcast today.
Oh, Gary, you're muted.
That's the best way to have Gary, honestly, is keep him muted.
Now that's staying in the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Hayes. Thanks. I appreciate that. I know where I stand. Bottom of the ocean somewhere. We'll get into that detail, but we're going to leave that alone. Hey, Denise, I appreciate Justin's comments, the linear focus, and then how you kind of define that, all the other players that are happening. But maybe just for the sake of the audience, who typically in today's current state are involved in this? I know we talked about the reps, but who from an internal standpoint in that OR to outside that OR for replenishment, who's involved? I think it's good to set the stage and then maybe where it's going from there. I think it's important.
Hey, Gary, it's a great question. For every case, there's a lot of stakeholders that are involved. So on the provider side, you'd have a circulating nurse, supply chain within the hospital, sterile processing, and the surgeon, and then, of course, accounts payable. On the supplier side, you've got the sales rep, sales operations, customer service, field inventory, accounts receivable, the warehouse. So there's a lot of stakeholders involved. To put this into perspective, I did a quick Google before joining. According to Orthopedic Design and Technology, they did a study. This was back in 2021. So this is actually just post-COVID. There was over 7 million orthopedic procedures, just orthopedic procedures in the U.S. annually. So just think about that number of individuals having to touch a part of the process for every single case. It really is mind-blowing, and it's really difficult to contemplate that many people and that much complexity. And complexity adds cost, right? So we look at, why is healthcare so expensive? This is one of the key reasons, and it's one of the reasons why we have to focus on improving the process, because it's adding a lot of cost.
So why the difficulty for the front lines? And that's a large part of our audience. So, some of the people that are listening to this are like, oh, I know what the issues are. But what is the underlying issue with the process in terms of like ultimately executing on payment, right? Because there's a lot of things that have to line up, and that's where we're running into difficulty in the parallel process, right?
Yeah. So let's get to the nonlinear issues that ensue when after a case actually happens. But it is important to note, Hayes, you're absolutely right. 20 years ago, the process that you used is not too different than what it is today. So when a case is underway, the circulating nurse, in very close coordination with the rep, they're going to document what's used in the case. And this is on a case sheet. It can be sticker sheets. It can be handwritten notes. Ultimately, that data gets loaded into the electronic health record system of the hospital, and it's along the patient record is where that data is being captured. One thing I'd note, it's not uncommon that there could be data accuracy issues during the case because documenting what was used is not the top priority, right? It's the patient that's the priority. So sometimes, You can have issues, but that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem comes after the case. So this is the big aha moment. Then we talk about the nonlinear processes. So once the case is complete on the manufacturer's side, the rep needs to replenish that inventory that was used. So they will create a sales order in their field inventory system that feeds their manufacturer's ERP system that generates a replenishment. And that sales order will sit out there waiting for a purchase order from the hospital before it's invoiced and then subsequently gets paid. So they will not even trigger an invoice until a PO is received. On the provider side, so imagine these two things happening at the same time. A PO gets created after the case, and the usage data is entered in the provider's ERP system. So this is 3 entry points. We've got the electronic health record, fueled by the use case during the procedure. We've got the sales order of the rep. Then we have the requisition or purchase order being created by the hospital in the ERP system. So I'd ask the three of you, how many times do you think all 3 of those documents be exactly the same?
Not often.
What is even the probability of that? Like you'd have a better chance of buying a lottery ticket and winning the lottery than getting all of that right, especially if you have a lot of lines on a purchase order.
It's also really difficult to get the clinicians to verify what was used too, right? Isn't that one of the major challenges? We've talked about it a little bit on our sister podcast, First Case, which is for the operating room nurses and surgical techs, but it's just not top of mind when the patient's literally on the table right in front of them. And they're not necessarily always very familiar with the products. Like they are familiar with it, but not from a supply chain perspective always, especially if you've got temp staff in there or you have somebody covering a service that they're not used to covering. Like that's where I feel like it gets really loose on, even to your point earlier, verifying whether or not something was even used.
And, it's not uncommon for it to take up to 2 weeks before a purchase order is received by the manufacturer rep and the manufacturer. So I don't know about you, but I can hardly remember what I did 2 weeks ago. I can't imagine trying to remember, hey, how many screws did I use when I did this, surgery? It's very difficult. So we have this elapsed time issue.
So Denise,
Gary has that problem often. He forgets.
What? What'd you say, Hayes? I can't remember. I'm not sure what you just said, man. But
that's because you already forgot, Gary.
That's right.
There you go.
All I have is right now. And
that's right.
So you're in the moment. You're in the moment. And we love that about you, Gary.
I got it coming, Hayes. Fair enough. I appreciate it. So Denise, this whole non-owned inventory, right? This is trunk stock. Call it what you want. This is an implant the rep brought in. They're using it. Who's really coordinating all these moving targets to make it happen? I want your opinion, your thought process on bill and replace with consignment inventory versus bill only, because we're not buying sets anymore. That was Hayes' world 35, 40, 50 years ago on, selling his sets. Those don't happen anymore. It's just too expensive. So what are your thoughts on consignment, bill and replace versus trunk stock replacement? Is it similar? Is it better for the hospital? I want your opinion on that too, Denise, please, for our listeners.
It's similar, but it's very different. And one of the things I always have to challenge people on is they're 2 very different processes for managing the billings. And with consignment is actually physically in the hospital, but the manufacturer does own that inventory. It's similar in that it's on the manufacturer's books. They need often the lot and serial number to be able to get that inventory off their books accurately. So they need similar information, but it's not as complex because you're not always waiting for a purchase order. Generally, when a consignment inventory is used, a replenishment is created by the hospital, and you'll actually get a purchase order on a more timely basis. With bill only, and those implant orders, the typical DSO for payment of those orders is between 60 to 90 days. And that is just horrible. And it's not sustainable for the industry. Again, it's adding costs. So we don't see as long of a time period with consignment, yet it is complex in that those additional data elements are needed for the manufacturer to manage the inventory that was used and for the whole entire process to be touchless.
I mean, that's a good point. But Denise, back to like my situation years ago and then where it should be now. Like, again, I literally would be in the OR. I'd walk out. I would give the paperwork to the head of OR. Her name is Minnie Lincoln, and I love Minnie. And Minnie would literally give me a PO, like real time. And so then I would go send that to my distributor. But what does that workflow should look like? What is it? What's ideal now?
The one thing I'll preface my answer to that with is one thing we need to recognize is that every supplier and every provider is different. And they are like snowflakes. And it's the same thing with regular orders, but we just need to understand everyone is a little bit different. What I can just tell you is there need to be standardized processes between the manufacturer and the hospital to support bill-only orders. But not every hospital and every manufacturer needs to be exactly the same. Okay? They aren't exactly the same in how they manage consignment. They're not exactly the same in how they manage regular orders. There are some nuances. But I think if you have some standardization, we can improve the process. So anyway, to answer your question, this is how the workflow should work. And I'm going to share this with you, and all the listeners need to know what I'm describing right now is actually being implemented today in the United States in healthcare with real providers and suppliers. So first, we've got to capture the right price, the right products, and generate a purchase order within 12 hours of the completion of a case. That's the first thing that needs to happen. And that needs to match what's in the electronic health record system. So that's number one. Number two, we need to ensure upfront, before we invoice anything, that the purchase order and the sales order match. And match at a line item level, and the pricing is all matching. Okay? And that's important so that you can have the whole case to cash flow 100% touchless. The third step, we need to invoice the same day that we receive a purchase order. And lastly, hospitals need to accelerate payments on the invoice to be 15 days or less. So that's the process. That's like the shining star.
I love how you just delivered that 15 days or less and then waited for a second, right? Because that's unfathomable for most people.
So here's the thing. There are trading partner pairs, manufacturers and providers that are piloting solutions. I'm not saying it's mainstream yet. Piloting, and they are making changes in the industry today where they have touchless bill-only orders flowing and getting paid in 15 days or less. So it can be done. It can be done. So when I say the time is now, the time is right to do this now, we have the right processes. We have the right technology. We just need to implement it and, understand that, it's going to take time before we get it 100% correct, but it can be done. And we're actually seeing these results already. It's exciting.
Denise, you're making me think, because I always bring up the best case scenario for the mission and the patients and everything to work best. So we're not focusing on so much labor intensive, terrible swim lanes to make it better. I want a scope of work in my next agreement that says that. That scope of work is part of the agreement for an implementation. You throw it out there. Can you be a part of this to make this solvable as a true partner within the hospital to ultimately do what we need to do is support our patients? So I really like what you said there. So thank you.
It is a partnership, and that's really what is going to be required for it to be successful. the trading partners that are being successful right now have a couple of things that are really important. And number one is trust and accountability, right? Number two is accountability. So trust and accountability. And, in this space, we haven't always had that between manufacturers and providers. So we've got to start there to be able to see these results. But I can tell you it's happening. But you have to have that partnership, Gary. You raised a really good point because it's not going to happen if you don't have that.
No. And it's so important to have somehow some transparency to walk in. How many times does a rep change? How many times does an internal circulator change? To Justin's point earlier, it's like you feel like you walk into some of these hospitals, whether it's an ASC or a giant system, and Hayes is the owner of all the information. And you got questions, you go to Red. He's like Shawshank Redemption. He can get you things, anything you need.
Right,
and then they leave. And you're like,
right.
Oh my gosh, how do we transfer that knowledge? That's just all here. Whereas it's not somewhere in an ERP implementation or a true document or something, a process flow. So I think it's so important.
And Gary, that's what our hospitals and manufacturers need to start with. And it's kind of fundamental, right? You have to have a process flow that you agree to. And it needs to, and again, allow for some variation. So as an example, if you have a manufacturer from spine is much more complex than an orthopedic manufacturer in a case. So your process needs to account for that. Like how you're going to capture what's used in a spinal fusion surgery versus a knee replacement surgery is going to be a little bit different, but you're going to share the same information. You're going to follow the same flow, and it's not going to be different in, operating room number 1 versus operating room number 5 versus where you're doing trauma. It has to be consistent with that manufacturer for that service type. So I think that's where we actually have to get started in defining that. And then it goes back to, really making sure the appropriate information is able to be shared electronically with one another. And again, we're holding one another accountable.
Amazingly, I feel like we got a lot covered, but we've got about 5, maybe 10 minutes left. And I want to make sure we talk about what people can do to improve this, because you just, painted a picture of what it can be and what it is for some people out there, right? 15 days, boom, done. Like everything flows. And that's what we're trying to create, right? More smooth flow in general. We're dialing in on one area where the flow doesn't really go very well in healthcare, but there's lots of energy being put in all facets of healthcare to try to establish flow, because we know that that's when everything is working at optimum efficiency. So let's start with suppliers, because there are suppliers that are listening to this, but I'd say largely it's the providers that are listening. So let's start with suppliers. What could they be doing better to be moving towards a more ideal state?
So the first thing I'd say that's important is ensuring at the end of the case that the rep actually has agreement and sign off from the clinician on what was actually used in the procedure. The other thing that we have to be open to do, if a provider's open to having the sales rep enter in the information that was used, have them feed their data from their field inventory system or another solution into the hospital's ERP system to create the requisition. So surprisingly, many providers are open to that. So I want to get the information from the rep, have them do the work. It's going to be trust but verify on the provider side, but have it keyed in once. And that way you ensure that all the line items match, all the pricing is matching. So that would be something that the suppliers should look at enabling on behalf of their providers.
I want to add something to that. too. As we get better and better at looking at cost per procedure, I think one of the concerns people might have, I'm not saying this is happening, I'm not making accusations, but I think one of the concerns people would have is if you're letting the rep enter it, does that open us up to fraudulent billing, right? Does that open us up to, cost creep from inaccurate, inventory being reflected as used during the case? I will say, I feel like as we look at cost per procedure, they're starting to compare one surgeon to another, and those types of analytics are coming into place. Wouldn't that effectively lead to a point where that person actually loses the business? Because if they're doing something like that, their cost per procedure is going to be disproportionate to everybody else. And that should that give providers confidence in taking that step? Or is there something else that's going on that, like you said, surprisingly, many providers are more than willing to allow that to happen? So, is that one of the reasons that they have, better aggregate reporting on all of that? Or is there another reason?
So I don't want to come across as like I got my head in the sand and there aren't any bad actors out there. There are manufacturers. So I go back to, I said, we got to take accountability. We need to take accountability for ensuring that the price is right. As we work through these processes, there's going to be times we find out, the pricing was wrong in the hospital system. Oh, the pricing was wrong in the supplier system. There's got to be processes after the fact where you can audit the data and say, hey, look, we had an issue here. Ideally, as you're setting up these processes with your manufacturers, on the provider side, you really do need to have that kind of audit process in place, but it can't be for every single individual case, right? That you're taking it under the microscope. It's got to be that you've come to agreement with your manufacturer. Hey, we're going to audit this on a weekly basis to start, on a monthly basis to start. The suppliers and providers who are doing this right now started out, they're like, you know what? We started out 30% of our orders had pricing issues or unit of measure issues or what have you. Now they're down to less than 10% because they met with one another and they figured out what the problems were. But they're going to launch new products. They're going to have new contracts. There could be gaps in timing of getting information. That's why you have to work as partners, right? You've got to share the information. You've got to be open to, hey, we made a mistake. But, let's go fix it. And it was a mistake on 30 cases, right? And so let's catch these things early. It should be you catch it the first time it occurs and you don't let it happen and be recurring. But sticking with the manual processes that take 90 days to execute isn't a good reason to stay the same. Because guess what? Right now, 30% of the line items have price exceptions. So, not automating it, not sharing the data, it's not like you're losing anything today. You've got a better shot, I believe, of working with your manufacturers and building those trusting relationships. But I do honestly believe it's trust but verify is the way that everybody should be operating. And that's what good partners do.
I would hope that any discrepancy would be a mistake, rather than obviously, they're trying to game the system. But I have, again, going back and relating to my days in the OR, I was literally part of the whole process, not because I was so good, but because they didn't have the resources. I mean, the circulator's doing everything. Everybody's busy, and having the manufacturing rep was an absolute service. It was a good thing. And I would sure hope, that the reps don't take advantage of that, particularly on, gaming the system and the pricing. And I'd love, if you're a provider out there, I'd love to kind of get a feel for how much do you see reps absolutely, are they gaming the system? Are they kind of, doing things wrong? That would actually be a whole nother conversation in itself. But anyway, I just thought that as a rep, we actually did provide some value to the hospitals, particularly in the under-resourced places.
So Hayes, I fully agree with you. The reps are providing an incredible service for the patients, for the surgeon, and are really valued by the hospital. But there are some bad actors that are out there. I met with a provider a week ago, we actually had the GHX Summit. And, he told me a story about a rep that was banned for life from their hospital. But the way I look at it is, just like a manufacturer is responsible for the quality of their products, they're also responsible for the quality of their reps. And it's that accountability, right? You can't have bad actors in this process and expect to see improvement. And I know again, I don't have my head in the sand. I'm a big advocate for manufacturers. I believe in, all of the innovation and the good behind the manufacturers I work with day in and day out. I guess the takeaway here is if you really do want to improve the process, you've got to drive that accountability and partnership, and you can't let those things happen. You just can't in any organization. And that's it's not sustainable, just like, it's not sustainable to have a 90-day DSO. So these are the dirty diapers. I can smell them. They're out there, and you got to address those things before you can improve the process. So it's embracing the change, right? So, but we are all babies in this. So hopefully we all learn together.
Well, Denise, you tied it up into a nice bow right there. And to get around the world on bill only PO or case to cash, I like that. To do that in 35 minutes is commendable, especially with some best practices sprinkled in there and where we can all kind of take a look at improvements. Is there anything you want to add before we wrap up? I mean, you can't cover it all in a podcast, but you can certainly set the table for ongoing discussion and make sure everybody kind of knows the key elements to having better success in this area.
I listen to a lot of podcasts. I get inspired. I get jazzed. I'd ask your listeners to take it one step further and start looking at, how can they actually improve the process? And if they can't do the 4 steps that I just outlined, do one. Or start planning to do one, like set the goals to actually improve. We really owe it to the patients to improve the cost of healthcare. We owe it to all of our loved ones. I'd love the manufacturers to have more money to do innovation and less money to be wasting their time on, all of these processes. And you just think about the stakeholders who are involved. There's no one of those stakeholders that enjoy this process. So let's take the cost out and, start small and it's the crawl, walk, run. It goes back to the baby. Everybody has to take the steps. And if we do, the industry will be better as a whole.
Denise Odenkirk, everybody. Great job, Denise. Thank you. That was Denise Odenkirk, VP of Supplier Sales at GHX, talking about that bill-only PO process, the dynamics around it. Lots of discussion in this area. Hayes, sounds like you really had it together as a rep. No wonder you climbed the ladder the way that you did and now doing your own thing. Like, it's because you're on top of it, man.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. That ladder. Yeah, that's not what I'd have called it, but I was very fortunate. This whole process that we just talked about, it's very, very clunky. It's old. It hadn't changed. And as I said, 20 years ago, I was actually fortunate. I could leave the OR with the PO in my hand every single time. And obviously it's still not happening, but it should. It needs to be done, be more efficient. And she laid out some really good ways to do that.
Yeah, I think it's really just an order of operations issue that really can cause a lot of confusion at the tail end. And honestly, like, she made a really great point from the supplier perspective too. Like, not collecting payment for a really extended period of time, that creates cash flow issues. So there really is skin in the game, I think, on both sides of this equation to make improvements. So great job today. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, everyone, thank you for listening to this episode.
Power Supply.
Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.